Today we're going to be talking about topic 4.3, carbon cycle. So the essential idea is that the continued availability of carbon in ecosystems depends on the carbon cycle. So ecosystems need carbon to be cycled. Without it, they could not survive. To illustrate this point, the coal in this picture here that you're seeing is formed entirely from partially decayed and fossilized plant and animal remains. Fossil fuels are a valuable sink of carbon. So when you hear me say the word sink, I'm talking about like a storage of carbon. So where carbon's just sitting, not moving, we call a sink. Think of like the pantry in your kitchen that is storing food that you're not using at this moment for cooking. The sink is kind of like that. It's a storage of energy that hasn't been used yet, and it's made of carbon. So this picture here is showing you a carbon cycle diagram, and all carbon cycle diagrams vary a lot, and they are estimating usually the movement in gigatons per year. So if you see this GTC, gigatons per year, okay, is how they would measure the movement of carbon between sinks and fluxes right here. So anywhere you're seeing it in yellow or an arrow moving, that's a flux. So it's the movement of carbon. Oftentimes it's as CO2. Sometimes it's in the form of sugars, C6H12O6, or sometimes it's in hydrocarbonate, which is often in the ocean. So anything with a C, right, that represents carbon, and the movement of it is going to be a flux, okay? Here in parentheses, anywhere you're seeing numbers in parentheses are going to represent sinks of carbon. So you can see soil is a major sink, a fossil fuel pool, reactive sediments like limestone, and in deep ocean areas are big sinks for carbon. And then you also have the atmosphere up here. And then you have natural areas where you're going to see movement. So for example, the process of photosynthesis is usually going to take CO2 from the atmosphere into the trees. But then trees also do cellular respiration, so they release CO2 back into the atmosphere. This plant as a whole, this biomass is a sink, so you can see the parentheses here, so it's made of sugars, right, from when it did photosynthesis. So you're seeing a bunch of sinks and a bunch of fluxes happening in this image here. And then you could also look at it from the sea-based diagram, so you're looking at phytoplankton as the plants doing photosynthesis instead of this tree here. And you can see how it's being exchanged between CO2 or carbon in general is being exchanged between the atmosphere and the ocean and the things that live within it and the sediments. So we'll look more deeply at a diagram at the end of this, but let's get into specifically these different sinks and fluxes. So all autotrophs or producers, however, are going to convert carbon dioxide, remember, which is inorganic, from the atmosphere or dissolved water into organic compounds, so into sugars. So remember, plants do photosynthesis using light and CO2 from the atmosphere, so this would be a flux going into the plants, and they're going to produce sugar, C6H12O6, and plants are considered, or biomass, living things in general, are considered a large carbon sink. So plants initially synthesize sugars, for example, glucose, which are then converted into other organic compounds such as complex carbohydrates, starch, cellulose. Remember, we went over those in 2.3. And you can see how the carbon structures can get more complicated or complex. They can also be involved with lipids and amino acids. Although most autotrophs fix carbon by photosynthesis, remember there are a few that are called chemoautotrophs, which means chemical instead of photo with light. Chemoautotrophs fix carbon by utilizing the energy in the bonds of inorganic compounds such as hydrogen sulfide. And usually these chemoautotrophs live in deep parts of the ocean by sea vents or volcanic sea vents, and they use the chemicals coming out of those cracks in the ocean floor and create energy from those. Okay, so the next part is in aquatic ecosystems, carbon is present as dissolved carbon dioxide, but also as hydrogen carbonate ions. So you maybe have heard of something called ocean acidification, and this is part of how that ties in to it. But normally, carbon dioxide will directly dissolve into water from the atmosphere, but most will combine with water to become carbonic acid. So you can see here is carbon dioxide, a carbon and two oxygens, in the atmosphere, it's going to dissolve into the water, and it's going to interact with this water molecule here, and you're going to end up with carbonic acid, which is when you see there's it's 2 H's, so 2 hydrogens, and then 3 oxygens and a carbon. We call that carbonic acid. After a while, though, some of these hydrogen ions, they kind of have a weak association with the oxygen, so they break away. And anytime you add H plus ions or hydrogen ions to a substance, it makes it more acidic. It reduces the pH, so it makes it go more away from 7 to like a 6 or a 5. And that acidity is interacting with aquatic animals and affects their shells that they have, and it's dissolving their shells. So this excess CO2 that we hear about in our atmosphere these days from burning fossil fuels is increasing that acidic effect in our oceans more than naturally would be happening. So here's the chemical equation down here. You have the carbon dioxide interacting with water. That gives you carbonic acid. But then the carbonic acid dissociates and you have single H plus ions, and now the carbonic acid turns here into this molecule. And you have these H plus ions increasing the acidity, or reducing the pH of the water, which means it's becoming acidic. So the next understanding is carbon dioxide diffuses from the atmosphere or water into autotrophs. So we just talked about that a little in the beginning, but just so you can see how this happens with plants or autotrophs. Plants have a constant supply of carbon dioxide to continually do photosynthesis. And carbon dioxide comes from outside the leaf in the atmosphere and diffuses through something called a stomata. So this is like plant cells here, and this is the outer edge of the plant. This would also happen sometimes for aquatic plants. If they don't have stomata, it's just going to directly diffuse through their surface tissues. So it's going to come from the atmosphere of the water, go through the stomata, and it moves from high to low, just like water does in osmosis. It moves from a high concentration to where there's less of it. So the CO2 is pulled in because of that gradient, right? It's kind of like a vacuum pulling it in. And the plant will use it to keep the concentration of CO2 inside the leaf. Or photosynthesis uses CO2, which will keep the CO2 inside the leaf low, so it'll keep pulling that CO2 in to keep doing photosynthesis, because as it's used during photosynthesis, right, it becomes less. So once the carbon dioxide is inside the plant, right, it's going to do photosynthesis and it's going to create sugars. So sugars are also a carbon molecule, so C6H12O6. But then plants use those sugars to create ATP. So carbon dioxide is produced by respiration and diffuses out of organisms into water or the atmosphere. So any living thing that does cellular respiration is going to release CO2 as a byproduct or a waste product. So plants do this, we do this. Anything that needs to convert that glucose, C6H12O6, into ATP. So here you can see this kind of review of cellular respiration. We have that glucose goes into glycolysis. Glycolysis, remember, only creates pyruvate and then 2 ATP molecules. At this point, this is happening in the cytoplasm. It can either go into anaerobic respiration, which continues in the cytoplasm, and it means there's no oxygen available for the process. If animals are doing this, we produce lactic acid as a byproduct, and that's what makes your muscles sore, and we get very little ATP. And if plants do this, they produce ethanol, but they also produce CO2 as a byproduct. That's why we get those bubbles in bread when we're making bread. If there is enough oxygen and it goes from the cytoplasm into the mitochondria, it's aerobic respiration, meaning it's using oxygen, and at the end of the process, you're going to get lots of ATP, 36 to 38. You're going to release water as a waste product, but also CO2. So in terms of the carbon cycle, there's 3 main categories of organisms that carry out respiration. There's the autotrophs, which would be plants, heterotrophs, which are animals, and sapiotrophs and decomposers, which, remember, a sapiotroph or saprotroph is like a fungi. They digest externally, and decomposers would be like typical bacteria who ingest, they digest internally. So those would be the characters that are releasing CO2 doing cellular respiration. So that will then, CO2 will then flux back to the atmosphere or into the environment around it. So peat is, you maybe never heard this word before, but peat is basically a very compressed, not fully decomposed piece of dead plant debris. So peat forms when organic matter is not fully decomposed because of acidic or anaerobic conditions in waterlogged soils. Waterlogged means like swampy type of soil, so it has a lot of water in it, but the water is not moving, and that's reducing the amount of oxygen that's in that area, and that reduces what types of bacteria can actually break it down. So because nothing's there to fully break it down, it's going to break down very slowly, over time it compresses into this material called peat. And peat eventually is what we would call coal. And coal burns very easily and efficiently. And so this would be our first type of fossil fuel we would be talking about, but it comes from peat. So peat is partially decomposed organic matter, and it's compressed to form this brown soil-like peat. Peat is a highly effective carbon sink, so we have a lot of this throughout Earth, and it's estimated that the world's peat contains about 550 gigatons of carbon, so it's a very efficient sink. Now, it is a fossil fuel since it's coal, and you can see here this is a power plant in Finland using it. When you burn coal, it creates a lot of heat, which we then use to create steam, which spins a turbine, and that makes electricity. So peat forms when organic matter is not fully decomposed, like we said. So it's found, first of all, in soils that have a lot of organic matter, so dead leaves or that are digested by sapiotrophic bacteria and fungi. Sapiotrophs will then assimilate some of that carbon for growth and release it as carbon dioxide during aerobic respiration. So in these higher levels here, we're seeing bacteria or decomposers do what they're supposed to do when oxygen is available. But as you get deeper here, you can see this waterlogged type of soil, and we would call that an anaerobic environment. So saprotrophs and methanogens, which these are bacteria that can produce methane as a byproduct, are inhibited. So they're not able to sit and break down that organic matter, and the organic matter will now only be partially decomposed. And that creates this cycle. So when there's partially decomposition happening, you're going to get acidic conditions, which means they're even more inhibited, so they can't break it down. And then you're getting this partially decomposed situation, which will lead to large quantities of partially decomposed organic matter building up over time. And then that organic matter, when compressed over time from just different layers of sediment occurring, so millions of years, you're going to get peat, which would be coal. So coal is formed when deposits of peat are buried under other sediments. So here you can see this would be that dead plant debris, dead plant matter. In picture, there were different continents around the equator in a tropical climate at a time, and so those plants have now died on certain continents, and they were trapped and slowly decomposed underground. So in places you don't picture having this type of growth that did at one time, and all of that dead organic matter has now been pushed down from pressure over time, and it's created coal. So heat and pressure, it's metamorphosized it, and now we have coal. So the peat is compressed and heated over millions of years, eventually becoming coal. The cycle of sea levels changes that happened during the Carboniferous period caused coastal swamps to be buried, promoting the formation of coal. Two other fossil fuels are oil, coming from petroleum, and then natural gas formation, and they usually are found around each other. So anytime you're seeing a device like this would be drilling for oil, and you're going to be finding natural gas collections around it. So oil and gas formations occurred in ancient oceans. So here you can see this about 300 to 400 million years ago. Tiny sea plants and animals died and were buried on the ocean floor. Over time, they were covered by layers of silt and sand. So these conditions would be anaerobic, and so their decomposition is going to be very slow and partially decomposed. Because once something fully decomposes, it's no longer going to have that organic material that we can burn like coal or oil and gas. So it has to just be partially decomposed. So here you can see over time more sand and silt, and here are the plant and animal remains from the past, but we have a thick layer of sand and silt there protecting it, keeping it from decomposing all the way, and it has a lot of heat and pressure on top of them, which is going to eventually lead to them changing into oil texture and natural gas around it. So methane also forms the largest part of natural gas that we find in our natural gas around oil. So those three fossil fuels that I was talking about, when we burn those, the flux so they're a large sink on an ocean floor. And when we burn those, they are going to release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and so that will be a flux from a once buried carbon sink. And then one of our other carbon sinks are animals such as reef-building corals and mollusks have a hard part that they're composed of called calcium carbonate. So again, you see that word carbon, and that can be fossilized in limestone. So all these shells are made of, they have all carbon in them and calcium. So some animals will secrete this calcium carbonate in their shells or their hard exoskeletons like corals. When the animals die, the soft body parts decompose, but the calcium carbonate remains and forms deposits in the ocean floor. So this is making that soil sediment in the ocean be a large carbon storage. So the deposits are buried and compressed and eventually form limestone rock, which usually has a ton of carbon in it. Imprints of their hard body parts remain in the rocks as fossils. So limestone rock, anytime you hear that, know that it's a huge carbon sink. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of the carbon sinks, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the fluxes here. So carbon dioxide is produced by combustion of biomass and fossilized organic matter. So when we burn trees, for example, like you can see here is happening, this is going to be releasing tons of carbon dioxide because you're burning organic matter, which is made of carbon. When you burn fossil fuels, like here, this coal here, or when you do a barbecue, that's technically like peat when you look at those carbon that we use when we do barbecues. And when you burn that, it's also releasing carbon dioxide because you're technically burning organic matter, right? So here you see fossil fuels or biomass plus oxygen. When you add oxygen to it, you're going to get fire. And that's going to release carbon dioxide, but also water. So we hear a lot about, in 2019 and 2020, we were hearing a lot about how there was huge fires in the Amazon rainforest. And there was a lot of blame going around, and there was even some conspiracy theories, and then there was some, like, it's just happening naturally. The government was saying that, lightning strikes, and it's dry sometimes during those months, and then they've just gotten out of control and just keep burning. But they believe that a lot of farmers were doing the slash and burn technique, which is to slash trees and then set it on fire in order to clear the land for farming, for their growing population, and to make money. But in these precious areas like the Amazon rainforest, where we have tons of species and biodiversity, is that the best practice that they should be doing in that specific region, right? So with current scientific evidence giving overwhelming support to global warming, and is because of us burning organic matter and releasing this carbon dioxide, would slash and burn, clearing of land for farming, be an acceptable practice? Should it still be an acceptable practice? We see this here too in Venezuela, where this is how oftentimes people take care of trash, and that's the way it is in lots of countries. And you're burning, some of it is organic matter, so it's also releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is contributing to this intensive greenhouse effect in global warming. So we would call those a flux, right? This is a flux when we change, or we take a sink and we change it and we release and move carbon into our atmosphere. Okay. The last character we want to talk about is methanogens. Now, methanogens are archaea, which is a domain of types of bacteria. They're like the ancient bacteria that can handle really extreme environments like hot springs or very acidic environments. So methanogens are archaeobacteria, microorganisms that produce methane as a metabolic byproduct in anoxic conditions. So anoxic means no oxygen. Typically during ATP production, methane is produced from carbon dioxide. So when we look here, cows release a lot of methane. It's a gas in their body when they're digesting their food. And there's methanogens that might live inside their digestive tracts. And the methanogens are what are creating that methane because they're digesting the food that the animals eat, and then that's releasing methane from the cows when they release gas. Marine and freshwater sediments, for example, like mud in the beds of lakes, or here when this would be like a rice paddy fields here when they flood them. Those are going to be areas that aren't going to have a ton of oxygen in them, and you get a lot of the methanogens living in them, and they release methane. Landfill sites, so anytime we're decomposing our trash, you're going to see a large amount of organic matter being buried, and that as it's decomposed by methanogens, they are going to release methane. So a lot of times, even if it's a covered landfill, you're going to see pipes coming from the ground releasing methane into the atmosphere so that it doesn't create so much pressure under the ground. Otherwise, you're going to get the ground sinking and changing formations because of that expansion, because it's filling with gas. So they release that methane into the atmosphere. And then wetlands, like I already talked about, rice paddies or swamps or mangroves. So this is particularly where methane is being released from, and because of these little microorganisms called methanogens. Now, methane is also considered a greenhouse gas, just like carbon dioxide. So, and methane is and why you might be wondering, why are we talking about methane? Like right here, typically during ATP production, methane is produced from carbon dioxide. Methane is CH4, so it has carbon in it and 4 hydrogens. So when methane is produced from any of the methods we just talked about, it usually will stay in the atmosphere for about 8.4 years. So it has a lower residence time than carbon dioxide. And so you can see here, this is some data from the Mauna Loa, Hawaii station in the Hawaiian Islands. And they collect this about different chemicals in our atmosphere. So this is for methane. And you can see here there's been a steady trend of it increasing over time. And it starts here around 1987. But it's nice that it doesn't stay for so long, because usually methane readily reacts with hydroxyl radicals, so OH ions that are in our atmosphere. And that'll create carbon dioxide and water. Now the only problem with that is more carbon dioxide is an issue, because we already are releasing more of that from burning different organic matter. But methane is released into the atmosphere, but can be removed by multiple types of mechanisms. But it can still add more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere in the long run. So when we look here at something to remember when you're looking at carbon cycle diagrams is it is not possible to measure the size of the carbon sink and the flux between them. Estimates are usually based on many different measurements and are often published with large uncertainties as a result. So even though you're seeing these numbers here, realize that there is a lot of uncertainty between them, but it's to give you an idea of how big one could be and how much actually moves to the next location. So let's take this and we're going to connect it a little bit to the topic of climate change and global warming. For this part, we're just going to look at analyzing air monitoring stations to understand what fluctuations there are in these types of gases in our atmosphere. And this is good evidence for helping us understand how carbon is moving throughout our atmosphere and biosphere and hydrosphere. So here you can see This is a picture, it's very famous. So over the past 40 years, Charles Keeling has measured atmospheric CO2 from his observatory in Mauna Loa, Hawaii. It is called the Keeling curve, and you have seen it a lot when people are trying to show evidence for global warming and the being connected to carbon dioxide concentration. So in this graph here, you can see time, and the dependent variable is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it's measured in parts per million. And here you can see the line actually goes up and down, up and down, up and down. And that's what this picture is showing you here. It's showing you, though, if you look at the months where it might be going up and down, this has to do with seasons. And what do seasons have to do with the difference or the change in carbon dioxide? Take a moment and think about that. We'll come back to that. But if we were to put a general best fit line through it, you can see the general trend is that it is increasing in amounts since 1960 here in this picture. This is showing you, though, we've only had these stations. We haven't had direct measurements for that long compared to the data you're going to see goes back all the way to 400,000 years ago. This graph's only going to 1500s, but all that data is from ice core samples. So with these ice cores, that's a picture here, whenever ice freezes, you get these bubbles that naturally form within that ice. And if you can extract the gas that's in there, you can see and measure how much CO2 was in there, how much oxygen was in there, and it gives us an idea of Earth's atmospheres in the past. Okay, so ice cores are an amazing way that they've been able to get historical data to compare what's been going on more recently since we've started the Industrial Revolution, and where we've been having a lot more human interaction with our atmosphere and burning of fossil fuels because they had been discovered at that point. So you can see here right around the Industrial Revolution is where we're seeing this CO2 amount start to increase. So there's stations like this all over the world. So we have the one in Mauna Loa. There's one, this is La Jolla Pier. This is from my hometown in San Diego. And then the South Pole is one here. So just to kind of look at 3 different data points. And you can see that they have different fluctuations and trends throughout the year, but an overall consistency and an upward trend. Here's the one from Mauna Loa. And if you look at it, this is showing you multiple years, so 2003 to 2008. And you can see, if you were to look at it, kind of think about what's the trend. Is it increasing or decreasing? And then also, what's the annual fluctuations representing? So take a moment, pause, and see if you could explain what's this showing us here. What's the trend, increasing or decreasing? And what do these annual fluctuations represent in the sense of the amount of carbon dioxide? So pause for a second. Okay. So what you should have noticed is that there is an increase in the atmospheric CO2 at the Mauna Loa year on year. We're noticing it's still increasing over time. And what do the annual fluctuations mean? So if we were just in general going to look at one up and down period, if you look at which months that's happening in, Mauna Loa is going to be in the northern hemisphere. So if you look when spring is, okay, versus in summer, that's when we're going to have most of the trees having green leaves and foliage, and they are going to be doing photosynthesis. So if they're doing photosynthesis, they're going to be using the CO2 in that atmosphere all the time, so you're going to see the CO2 go down. But then as the winter comes, if you notice October, November, December, January, a lot of those trees have lost their leaves, so they're not doing photosynthesis, so they're not using that CO2, so it starts to go back up. Okay. And then when this next season hits and there's more trees again, it starts to go back down. But in general, even with these natural annual fluctuations of seasons and how that affects trees and them doing photosynthesis, we see a general increase over time. This is showing you some of the ice core data that we talked about. So this is going back 400,000 years ago, and you can use these databases to look into research, and you can actually do IAs on these. You can do database IAs to show and look for patterns over time and discuss them. But here you can see they're looking at an ice core, and it's in a very cold room. They store these in extremely cold rooms, and they have to wear cold weather gear while they're in them because they need to preserve them. And these ice cores date back, depending on, you can find the depth of an ice core, can give you an idea of a year of when that sample of CO2 where you removed from that piece of the ice was taken. Ices show layers, just kind of like how soil does. And here you can see these ups and downs, okay, because we definitely go through different warming periods or interglacial periods, and then ice ages, so cooling periods, and you can see that naturally happening over time. And then you can also see here where we're at. So there are these times in history where there have been high levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, and you can see that they connect with the temperature. This graph down here represents temperature. So this gives us an idea that CO2 might be a reason for this. Now, what was causing the CO2 in the past? Maybe it was from different volcanic eruptions. So something was increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, where we believe we are what's increasing it this time. So something to think about, and notice that if you were to overlap these lines on top of each other, they follow each other almost perfectly. Okay, so what you're going to have to do is, in one of the skills on the IB exam is to be able to construct a simple carbon cycle. So you need to be able to represent and show the arrows of where things are going between sinks, which are these words up here, and flows, or fluxes, sorry, which are these words down here. And there's usually multiple arrows going from one thing to another. So I'm going to be giving you a different worksheet to do this on and explain it. It won't be exactly the same as this one, but you can see here, if you were to be able to manipulate this and move it around, the different fluxes interacting with the sinks. So here, the carbon compounds and producers, so this would be like plant matter. You can see that feeding to consumers is a flux, right? And then feeding between these animals is also a way of moving carbon, right? When we eat a cow, for example, who ate the plants, so there's carbon fluxing between these organisms. And we're also doing cellular respiration, so we're releasing CO2 to the atmosphere. Plants are doing photosynthesis, so they're taking CO2 from the atmosphere. This would be good to have an arrow going this way, but they also do cellular respiration, so they're adding it to the atmosphere. When we burn plants, like deforestation, we're doing combustion, so we're releasing it to the atmosphere. So you can see that's just some of the fluxes and flows here between like a regular food chain and the atmosphere. So I'm going to be giving you guys an assignment in a second for you guys to make your own carbon cycle diagram. Please write down any questions you have and your notes, obviously you've been taking this whole time, and add them to ManageBack right now, and we will go over your questions next class. Thank you and have a great day.